Well, welcome everybody. Um, our topic for tonight is what you can do now to plan for next season. So as I talk, if you have questions, just unmute yourself and let me know. I'll also be stopping at the end to see if anybody has questions at that point. So first of all, you have to evaluate in thinking about the 2021 season, you have to evaluate the 2020 season. Not that there was any races, but certainly everybody was training and trying to improve. So basically, it's important that you ask yourself how your training went. Did your numbers improve? Did your FTP improve? Did your time on events improve if you were doing a series of time trials? It's important that you look back at your data and make notes of that. Did you have any injuries? Did you have any illnesses? What led to those injuries and illnesses if you had them? You know, in regards to injury, did you up your mileage too quickly? Did you have a fall from the bike? Did you up your yardage too quickly in the pool? Those are all common causes of injuries. In regards to illnesses, discounting COVID, of course. But did you neglect recovery? Did you let yourself get overly fatigued at any point that sort of lowered your immune system and caused you to get ill? You can look back. That's one of the, I always talk about the importance of keeping a training diary. These are some of the stuff that you can go back and reference in your training diary to see exactly, if there's any way to kind of ferret out, if you would, what was the cause of the injury or what was the cause of the illness. And it's a learning process. And that's where, if you can identify the cause, was it avoidable? Just mental notes to make for the future. And again, like any season, when you're evaluating any season, you always want to look at your strengths and weaknesses. Was I climbing well, or was I not climbing well? How was my time trialing? How was my running? How was my swimming? And kind of sort of make a list. These are my strengths. These are my weaknesses. Because that kind of tells you what you want to start working on in the off season. And even working on now, because technically I wouldn't call this the off season. It's kind of the no season, if you would. But most people's off season doesn't start until later in September or even October. This year is kind of weird, obviously with COVID and everything. But we're going to talk about, what you can do at this point that'll later in the talk here in regards to training. But it's always good to have a strengths and weaknesses list, kind of like a pros and cons list, when you're trying to make a big life decision. A lot of people will make the pros and the cons list and try and weigh the pros against the cons. And after you've got this list, obviously, it makes the next point very, very easy in terms of what do I need to work on? Well, there you go. You've got your list of strengths and weaknesses. This time of year, we'll talk about this, but, I would focus on the weaknesses. Eventually you need to work on your strengths in addition to your weaknesses. because my feeling has always been, and probably always will be, is you win or lose races. You win races on your strengths. And basically what you need to do is you need to make sure that your weaknesses don't cause you to lose races. So you have to work on your weaknesses, but it's very, very seldom that somebody will, win a race on their weaknesses. It does happen, but it's very, very seldom. And when it does happen, it's usually a big surprise to everybody, including the athlete themselves. The other thing is how was my motivation this year? This was a tough year without races. This was a really tough year to stay motivated. If you could stay motivated in a year like this, that's a good thing. That means this is your training and your racing is important to you, or your training is important to you, I should say, for other than just racing. But that's something that, once again, that's something that as you're evaluating the 2020 season, how did with everything going on in the world, the COVID and, businesses and, shutting down, how was my motivation? Was my training a release from all the chaos in the world? That's not necessarily a bad way to train. At least it gets you out. So anyway, and I would highly encourage you as you're going through this evaluation to work with your coach if you have a coach, and to actually write this stuff down. Don't just talk about it. Write it down, because you need to refer to it as you start making your plans for the next season for 2021. Again, as part of the evaluation, other than just what we just talked about, which is kind of, a mental evaluation, if you would, you should think about getting yourself evaluated physically. If you're a triathlete, a gait analysis, how is my gait when I run? It changes as time goes on. As we get older, our gait definitely doesn't improve. It's like, but it's something that you can work on. A pedaling analysis. How is my pedal stroke? Am I smooth? Am I choppy? Am I efficient when I pedal? Same with swimming stroke. A swimming stroke analysis at a place like Swim Theory, they can tell you a lot about your swimming stroke, a whole lot about your swimming stroke. At Power Up, we can do videos about your pedaling and talk to you more about how to pedal more efficiently. Gait analysis, there's a number of places that do that. I know Nutriformance does a gait analysis, and I'm sure there's other places that do it also. But that is, this is the time, particularly when, in a normal year, you might actually have races, late season races, September, October, November, but this year you don't. So you don't have to worry about, your fitness so much in terms of having that racer's edge. And you can focus on these improvement things, which are big. And, they pay big dividends next year, not only in terms of a faster, potentially a faster performance, but also in helping to prevent injuries, which is a good segue into the next bullet point, which is physical therapy, having a functional assessment done and trying to identify muscle imbalances, whether it's strength or flexibility, front to back, side to side, is one side stronger than the other side? Do I ever notice that, it's always my left knee that bothers me. It's not my right knee, or it's my right hip that always, or my right glute, and me personally, it's my right glute, that bothers me. You know, if you can do a functional assessment, once again, I know most PTs do these. Certainly Jen Shook at Nutriformance does these, and they can actually identify those, help and give you exercises to correct that. And of course, your annual physical. You know, I recommend that all athletes have an annual physical. It's just a good thing to do in general, even if you're not an athlete, in my opinion. And, you know, you can learn a lot from the physical. And it provides a baseline so that if training and racing goes off during the season, this provides you a reference to go back and look at, you know, what was going on, you know, particularly blood chemistry. But, you know, the blood tells us so much about how healthy or not we are. It can help identify things such as anemia, vitamin or mineral deficiencies, low hormone levels, abnormal white or red blood cell counts. These are all things that can go haywire during a season. And the more time you spend training, the higher probability that things like this can go haywire, particularly if you're trying to balance a career with training and racing. And, you know, and sometimes, you know, you don't get as much rest as you should, and things just start to pile up. And I always recommend that if you can find a primary care physician who has experience working with endurance athletes, that is a big plus. Because not all physicians understand endurance athletes. And, you know, when they think about it, exercise, they think, you know, that's great. You know, how could exercise be harmful, you know, other than just injuries? Well, exercise can wear you down if you don't get proper recovery. And it's important to find somebody who understands that. So once you've gone through this evaluation, you want to start thinking about goals for next season, and beyond. The goals need to be specific. They need to be clear and well-defined, meaning a goal like, I just want to get better, is not particularly clear and it's not particularly well-defined. It needs to be quantitative as well as qualitative. So in terms of quantitative, we're talking about goal times. You know, I want to do a half marathon in under 3 hours. Or I want to do a 40K time trial in under an hour. Those are very quantitative things. And, you know, and qualitative things, you know, like we said, I want to be a better cyclist, or I want to be a better triathlete. You know, there's still place for those things. But they're hard to measure. And so that's why having quantitative goals are more definitive and easier to judge at the end of the day whether you achieved your goals. You should have short and long-term goals, and they should be time sensitive, meaning that, you know, it's like, you know, let's say your goal was to finish a 40K time trial in under an hour. When do you want to do it by? Do you want to do it by May? Do you want to do it by July? Do you want to do it by September? You know, there should be a definitive, endpoint's probably a bad term, but there should be a definitive timeline where I want to achieve this by then. The problem is if you don't have, a definitive timeline like that, then things can slip because it kind of takes the urgency away from the goal a little bit. And that, that's, in my opinion, that's a good example of a seasonal long-term goal. What a short-term goal may be is, next week I want to get 150 miles in on the bike. That would be a short-term goal. Or I want to increase my delay, my running from 20 miles a week to 25 miles a week. That would be a short-term goal. So it's a combination of the two that keeps you motivated to go out there every day and bust your ass. That's a technical term, by the way, the busting the ass. Your goals also have to be consistent with your talent, training, schedule, and priorities. I hate to break it to you, Roy, but you're not going to be in the Tour de France someday. Don't take that personally. So anyway, that's an extreme example, of course, because, when he was younger, he probably could have been there. But anyway, but the thing is, if
he can still go.
Yeah, he can go for sure. If you, what's a good example? Well, I mean, let's say, if because of family situation, work situation, whatever, you can only train 6 hours a week. This is kind of an extreme case, but 6 hours a week. The chances of you being able to do a 100-mile ride in under 6 hours, if all your training is 6 hours a week, is not very high. So you have to tailor your goals. It's a balancing act, between challenging yourself and tailoring your goals to your talent, training, schedule, and priorities. But they have to be realistic. Again, if you have a coach, this is definitely something you sit down and, put on paper. In my opinion, if goals aren't written down, they're not real. There's something about writing something on a piece of paper or typing it into a computer where you see it every day that makes it more real and kind of adds some additional motivation. And there's really, goals can be incremental, which is, and what I define as incremental is a natural progression from where you had been previously. So what's a good example? If you ran a 10K and you ran a 10K in let's say 50 minutes, then it's feasible and it would be a natural progression, assuming training schedule and priorities allow it, that you could probably do it in 48 minutes with the proper training. To me, that's an incremental goal. A stretch goal is a big jump in performance. So that would be like going from 50 minutes down to like 45 or 43. That would be a big jump. And a stretch goal, and this goal of a stretch goal I got from some triathlon site is their definition of a stretch goal is defined as a goal that combines exceptional performance with a high quality training and a really great day. And everybody waits for those really great days where and unfortunately, in my experience, so many of those great days happen in training. And you're just out there on the road and it's just like, oh my God, I literally could have won the world championships today. If they had been today, I would have been a world champion. that kind of day. But you should have stretch goals. In addition to incremental goals, you could have stretch goals. I'm not so sure I agree with that great day thing, because I've seen too many instances over the years where people's schedule and priorities changed, and all of a sudden they had a big, I would say, training schedule and priorities changed, and all of a sudden they had a big jump in performance in the absence of a great day. And that, again, that depends on your personal situation and how you're setting your priorities. But I've seen it happen. And there's really three types of goals. There's skill, performance, task commitment, or measurable outcome goals, which are completely under an athlete's control. So these are things like, I promise to get my ass out of bed every day and, either ride, swim, or run every day. That's a process goal. And that's, very, very measurable. And, that's one of those things, once again, if you write it down and you make that and you share those goals with somebody else, then you're really under pressure. Or if you have a training partner that's going to meet you for that run or that bike or that swim, that adds additional pressure to achieving those process goals. And those are important. Those are really important. Because, people that struggle, to do their training, this is the starting point that gets them out of bed in the morning. In terms of performance goals, these are individual athlete measurements independent of competition. So it's like, if one of your goals was, I want to improve my FTP by 20 watts by May of next year. Again, you got to put a timeline on it. That's a performance goal. Or if I want to lower my 10K pace from 9:30 to 9:15 from 9:30 miles to 9:15 miles, by April of next year. That's a performance goal. And you don't need competition in order to set those goals and know whether or not you achieve them. So that's a good thing. And then, of course, there's outcome goals. And those are competition-based goals. Those are important goals. If you're training for an event, those are very important goals. And, in my estimation, I think outcome goals are important. And I think if you're an athlete, you have to have outcome goals. If all you are is somebody who likes to train, then you don't necessarily need outcome goals, even if you do enter competitive events. But if you're truly an athlete, you have to have outcome goals, because outcome goals, they provide additional challenges to manage. Specifically, you've got to manage the competition. You've got to manage the environment, and you have to manage yourself. And of those three, a lot of times it's the self that is the hardest thing to manage. And what I mean by that is, can I convince myself to come up with a big performance on the day of competition? And that is, a lot of athletes struggle with that. Ashley wrote a really good article about 3 or 4 weeks ago about the difference between people who train well and people who race well. And it's really, you know, a lot of people train really, really well and they kick butt in training. But when it comes to race day, they just can't put it all together. And other people don't train very well. It's not that they don't train. And by don't train very well, I don't mean that they don't train. I mean that, you know, they never have a great performance in training. Those always come in racing. And as a coach and a team director, I would take the person who races well over the person who trains well 10 times out of 10. Because if you're a competitor, what's important is how well you race, not how well you train. It really doesn't matter who wins the training ride. And a lot of people struggle with that. So what do we do in the world of COVID when there may not be any outcome goals? What we do then is we focus on performance goals because that's all we have. And those have to become your, you know, what's driving you to get out of bed every morning and go out there and in that freezing cold pool, or hop on your trainer in your basement in the dark on Zwift and struggle with your computer because Zwift isn't working. That's what, you know, that's to me at least, that's where it falls. It's like, and if that happened, you know, if COVID carries on into 2021, obviously it will, but how it affect the racing season, nobody knows yet. Then it's, you know, then I would start, you know, maybe adding some additional performance goals to replace those outcome goals that you know aren't going to happen. But once again, if you have a coach, this is all stuff that you should go through with your coach. And, you know, and what's important, you know, the process, what's going to get me out of bed every day, you know, the performance, how much do I, as an individual, want to improve? Boom. The outcome, you know, what do I want to do in races? You know, so all good stuff. So planning. So now you got your evaluation, you know that, you know, the reason you're walking sideways is because one side's stronger than the other. And you got all these goals out there, you know, you got to get straightened back up so you can ride the tour. You only have like 6 months to prepare. So now you got to have a plan. How are you going to get there? You know, plans, excuse me, always start with a race schedule. When are my goal races or my goal events? And, you know, in my experience, you can probably truly peak twice a year, possibly 3 times, depending on how long the season is. But, you know, definitely twice a year. And when I mean peak, that doesn't mean you're horrible the rest of the time in your races. You know, you can even be doing really well in your races that are adding, you know, in preparation of your peak. Peaking is you're trying to manufacture that great day that we were talking about before. And that's what you're trying to do. Excuse me. And it can be done with a properly put together training schedule. It absolutely can be done. So once you've got your race schedule laid out, then you have to lay out your training schedule. And periodization, that concept of, you know, periodizing calendar year of training has been around for a long, long time. And in general terms, it starts with a rest recovery or transition period between one season and the other. This year is kind of different because there wasn't a 2020 season. So, does somebody still need the same amount of rest? I would say probably don't need the same amount of physical rest, but they just may need a mental break from the formality of following a training schedule. In terms of, and then from the rest, recovery rest time period, you go into the off season where, first of all, you're doing general body conditioning where you're just trying to make your entire body stronger. You're trying to address those imbalances and, you're working on strength or flexibility weaknesses that you listed, when you did your evaluation. And from that general body conditioning period, you go into specialization. And specialization is typically increasing the volume. And you're starting to move away from more general body conditioning and more sport-specific training, whether it's swimming, running, cycling, whatever. And for most people, there are exceptions, but for most people, that is the highest volume period in terms of actual training volume. From there, you move into your preseason. And now you're up in the intensity. Basically, you're doing race speed efforts. And then you have your race season. And basically what you're trying to do in the race season, and it depends on how much you're racing. Obviously, well, not obviously, but the sport of triathlon and the sport of cycling is very different. Cyclists do a lot more races than triathletes do. So when we're talking about cyclists, we're always kind of working around their races. And it's hard sometimes to build. You've got to just essentially say, this set of races is going to be more or less for training if you're building towards your peak. In the terms of triathlon, fewer races, it's easier to structure training to build towards an event. But that's kind of how you manage it. In terms of these weeks, and this is when you're scheduling the periodization at this time of year, it's very broad. It's roughly, from October 15th to December 31st is going to be my off season. And then, from January 1st to March 31st, actually that's 6 weeks. No, from January 1st to the middle of February is going to be my specialization period. And then from the middle of February until the middle of April, that's going to be my preseason, and I'm going to start racing in April. And at this time of year, that's about all you have to lay in. Just a very broad outline, because you're going to lay, your coach is going to, or you're going to lay in, or your coach is going to lay in the details once you get closer to that particular period. And the reason for that is all of those workouts depend on what you have done previously. So if you could guarantee that nothing was going to get in the way and you would never get sick and you would never get injured and, you wouldn't, no natural disasters would occur and no COVID would occur and so on and so on and so on, then you could just lay it all out, you know, a year in advance. But life doesn't work that way, as we all know. So you have to have a general outline where you fill in the details as time goes on. So now you've got your plan. So what do you do now? What should you be working on now? Since, you know, there's really no races to really look forward to. And, you know, it's kind of early for some people to take a break. You know, the weather's still nice out. You know, there's still plenty of daylight, so there's time to train. So what should I be working on now? You know, since there's no pressure, what should I be doing for no pressure training? First thing, aerobic capacity. Anything you can do to build your aerobic capacity always pays dividends. And what aerobic capacity is anything that is basically zone 3 or under. And, you know, you don't want, and, you know, the aerobic capacity is the hardest thing to change in terms of how much training it takes. It takes the most time. It takes the most volume to change your aerobic capacity. So that's something that you should always be working on. But now that is something that, you know, in terms of intensity, that's this right now, that should be pretty much the only thing you're working on. You know, if you go into the anaerobic workouts, if you do too many of them, they will actually, research shows that will actually decrease your aerobic capacity. So you don't want to be doing those sort of workouts right now. Unless there's some race on Mars that you're planning on attending and you actually need race fitness. It's, you know, everything you do should be steady state stuff. Efficiency, you know, what we talked about, you know, with the gait analysis, the pedal efficiency, the swimming, is since there's no pressure to get in shape, so to speak, you know, you can work on your efficiency. You know, when you're in the pool, you know, if you're in the pool twice a week, screw the workouts, just work on your stroke. You know, just try and improve your stroke. Don't worry about how many yards you're getting. You know, don't worry about how many, how many hundreds you're doing or how fast you're doing your hundreds. Work on being a better swimmer. Same way with your running. You know, work on, you know, don't worry about your mileage so much and just work on efficiency. Improve your gait. Take the information that you get from the PT and work on it. You know, even if it's in short stretches, you know, I go to the track and I just focus really, really hard for 2 laps. And then I walk. And then I focus really, really hard for 2 laps. And then I walk. You know, or your pedal stroke, focusing on your pedal stroke. Now's the time to do it. Because even if I would argue that even if you do that at the expense of some of the volume training, you know, it is September 1st. If you spent 2 months just working on efficiency, you have more than enough time to get in the volume you need for the 2021 season. If you didn't begin until, excuse me, if you didn't begin until November 1st or even December 1st. So if you can make yourself more efficient, it will pay big dividends next year. You know, rehab, again, low intensity. I'm not talking about lifting heavy weights. Rehab, evening things out, you know, going to a yoga class to get more, you know, more flexible. doing light weights, but doing, trying evening one side out versus the other side, getting everything sort of homogeneous, if you would. Now's the time to do it. Skills, same way. Efficiency skills, they're almost interchangeable, but what I'm really thinking is, I guess the example that always comes to mind is, if I'm a cyclist and, I need to learn to corner better, or I need to learn to descend better, or, those kind of things. Those are the skills I'm talking about. Maybe you hop on a mountain bike because it kind of forces you to make decisions a little quicker. But those are the sort of things, once again, when you don't have to necessarily worry about volume and you don't necessarily have to worry about intensity. It's, I'm worried about, it would be like if working on your free throws, if you were a basketball player in the off season. It's like, I'm just gonna boom, boom, boom. I'm just gonna shoot a bunch of free throws, and I'm gonna do it every day. I'm going to, how they have that push-up challenge. I'm gonna do 25 push-ups when COVID first started, or 50 push-ups every day for, however long. Well, I'm gonna get up and every day I'm gonna shoot 53 throws. So, maybe this is, I'm going to get up and, or 3 times a week, I'm going to go mountain bike. And I'm going to, keep getting faster and faster on the same course. As I speed up my brain to pick up different cues and see my lines better. That's just an example. A lot of things, and this is this bottom thing is just kind of a mistake that a lot of people make. And I don't think it's really a big concern this year because there was no racing. But I've seen many, many athletes over the years finish the racing season really, really strong and think that they'll just train through the winter and they'll come out in the spring even stronger. Well, what typically happens in those cases is these athletes are flying. Their best form all year, the following year, is in like March or April. And then they just fizzle. And they never get back to that racing form that they had in the early season. Unfortunately, when there aren't very many important races. Once again, I don't think that's a big deal this year because there was no racing. But that's just something to remember for future years because someday there will be racing again. I'm confident. And a parting thought. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but it's a habit. William Durant. William Durant was this, for those of you who don't know who William Durant was. William Durant was, if memory serves me correctly, he was more or less the founder of General Motors. So he probably, back then he probably knew about excellence, I guess. They've had rougher years, but back then it was pretty much something very, very special what he did. So anyway, anybody got any questions?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
The frequency of FTP, I realize that zones need to be reset. How often throughout the year, if one is not doing a 6-week camp program, would you recommend?
It's not set in stone. The it's interesting. I would say to try and answer your question, I would say every 8 to 12 weeks. It could be as often as 6 weeks, like we do in the camps. But interestingly enough, at the elite and pro level of cycling, once the season starts, cyclists no longer do FTP tests, and how they revise their zones is by race performance. And the reason they do that is because they can't afford to rest sufficiently in order just to do a test. So they just look at their numbers from their races, and that's how the coaches adjust their FTP. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Sure. Anybody else
Jim,
got any questions?
Jim, this is Mike. Can you
Yeah.
comment on, we talked about, you talked about going easier during the winter, during the off season. What about reducing your FTP when you're doing, electronic workouts over the winter to help encourage staying in the proper zones, or not beating yourself up when you don't need to?
As you know, I mean, that's a problem. And the reason that's a problem is because nobody wants their FTP to go down. Even in the off season, they don't want their FTP to go down. But I mean, realistically, what we probably should do is test everybody. But people don't want to be tested because they don't like that FTP test. So, you have to decrease it. You have to, I mean, your functional threshold goes down. And a lot of times, in the center is I will just make adjustments based on what I see, what I view as how hard somebody's working at any given workload. I will adjust their FTP down. I won't necessarily even tell them sometimes. You didn't hear that, David or Roy.
My wife is even smiling on that one.
But you're right, Mike. I mean, it's got to go down so they don't, so they're not working too hard. But it's one of those things that's hard, as you know from experience. It's one of those things hard to make people understand.
Excuse me, can you also, the FTP and the lactate threshold test, can we use those interchangeably in your answer?
Yes. The FTP, if you read the book on power that Andy Cohen and what's his name? I always forget the guy's name.
Allen.
Yeah. Basically, what the FTP test is, Andy devised the test because people didn't have access to a lab, so they couldn't get a lactate threshold test. So he came up with this as a field test that basically approximates what your lactate threshold is. That's how the FTP test came to be. So they, yes. So that's a long answer to a short question. Yes, they are. Although the values differ, the FTP test gives you a little higher number typically. In general, they can be, your lactate threshold is going to go down in the off season, just like your functional threshold goes down. Unless your name is Abby, and then it never goes down. That was an inside joke. Mike understands. Any other questions? Okay, then. I think that's a wrap. Thank you all.